everyone. Greetings. This is Mateo Scoggins with the Watershed Protection Department, Environmental Monitoring and Compliance Division. I'm going to give a quick overview of some work we've been doing lately to try to clarify and establish a little bit of a conceptual model about how our department and our staff think about watersheds and particularly urban watershed function. I'm really excited to be doing this because it's helping me kind of clarify in my mind why we're doing the work we're doing and how we think we might best be able to do that. Okay, let's jump in. I'm starting with this quote from one of my kind of favorite seminal ecologists, H.B. Hines, whose book from the 70s, The Ecology of Running Waters, was really formative for me and for many stream ecologists. He said, in every respect, the valley rules the stream. And in that one sentence, you really get this clear understanding that what we see in the water, in the creek, and I've spent the first half of my career just looking down at the things that were living in the creek, is driven very much so by the catchment, by the valley that drains to it. And I think just keeping that in mind as we go through this today is really important. Again, this is old information that we're just trying to more fully integrate into the way we think about watersheds. The things I'm going to want to try to get across to you today is, first of all, that a watershed, and we're going to talk about what that is, or a catchment, is the functional unit of the work that we do as a department. It is the thing that we can focus our energies on, the widget, if you will. And a healthy watershed is a way of saying that. Our division that recently formed, the Environmental Monitoring and Compliance Division, is responsible for understanding how these watersheds work, how they break, and how we heal them. That's our charge in this particular group at the City of Austin. We're kind of the watershed doctors. We are looking at the pulse, we're assessing, we're trying to understand acute and chronic problems and understanding what solutions might best solve those problems. There's going to be a lot of healthcare and doctor analogies in here, so bear with me. And then finally, our branch of the department, the Planning, Monitoring, and Compliance Group, kind of is holding a lot of the pieces together that would kind of come together and represent a watershed healthcare system. So that's just kind of a fun way to start thinking about the work we're doing. Just kind of backing up again, remind everyone what a watershed is. Watersheds come in every kind of possible shape and size. Some of them are massive. You could look at the entire watershed of the Mississippi River, for example, or the Amazon River. But we also, every little teeny tributary or little stream that comes into a larger river is also its own watershed. So this is an example, a cartoon that just kind of shows, importantly, the three-dimensional characteristic. A lot of time when you see a watershed in a picture, it's two-dimensional, and this captures the three-dimensionality and the critical interaction between the soil, the ground, the geology, and the water as it moves through that watershed. It's not just flowing over the land, it's soaking into the ground, coming out in groundwater, seeps and wetlands, as you can see there. It starts at the top in the headwaters. It forms a kind of a bowl, or often a watershed has a teardrop shape. In this case, it's just important to notice that there is a boundary, there's a high point around the watershed that defines it, and then it's all the area, the entire area that drains to that stream. In it, you do have different land cover types. You have woods and valleys and streams and rocks and all that kind of stuff. And fundamentally, when it rains, this watershed, any drop of water that falls within that watershed will go eventually down to the bottom of it in some way or another, or at least not every drop, but a lot of the water does. Some of it evaporates off and goes in other places. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about a watershed. We've kind of come up with this fun a heartshed concept just to try to make sure people are on board and understanding that in Austin we can use this as a conceptual model for how we define the area of work that we do, the area that we focus on. In Austin, in the west, we have our karst system. Our underlaid kind of geologic system in the west is karst and limestone. We have recharge zones, and then we have the alluvial kind of Blackland Prairie soil-driven system and clay in the east. In both of these cases, our hardshed drains down and our creeks come together and they end up at a receiving water, in our case, the Colorado River. But in that area, in that three-dimensional space that we talk about as our functional unit, we have springs and wetlands. We have recharge areas where water is very quickly moved into groundwater. We have in the east, we have slower alluvial recharge areas where upland alluvial aquifers are formed. We have water going in through precipitation, and then we have water coming out through either streams, springs, wetlands throughout this unit. So just keep this hardshed in mind. This is our area that we can focus the health kind of components of what we're trying to understand and repair and keep healthy. Conceptual models out of the way, let's kind of start with kind of a lot of the deeper science about how watersheds work. A seminal paper that came out in 1980, Van Noot et al. This is called the river continuum concept. And what this paper did was kind of lay out the kind of predictable ways that water moves, just like in that watershed graphic I showed you, from the very headwater at the very top of the graphic. As it moves down through the system, very specific and predictable things happen as you get farther down into the watershed, as the drainage area increases, as you move from what you would think of as a tributary to maybe a bigger river system. And what this concept did was help us start structuring what to expect, what type of processes occur in the headwaters versus the mid kind of reach areas and then down at the bottom. And I'm just going to kind of run through some of the key components of this. In the headwater areas, in the tops, and this is a tributary on the side coming in, and these systems are branched and have different network characteristics. But functionally, if you get up into an area which is a very small drainage area, those systems tend to be covered over with canopy. They tend to be shady. They tend to be often ephemeral. They don't have water flowing in them always. They tend to be driven by the inputs of the vegetation and the plant growth and the algae, the other upland plant groups and communities and systems that are up there. So a lot of their energy comes from those leaf matter that fall into there. The bugs and the animals that live up there are predictably different than they are as you move downstream. As you move downstream and this channel gets larger, you start getting more sunlight into there. You start having more water running through it. It tends to start being driven more by that fluvial process. You tend to have organisms and animals that are open to more sunlight getting into the system. Different larger organisms can start living in perennial waters and they live longer in the aquatic phase. Fish start becoming a lot more of a part of that system. And this continues until you get down into these larger river open systems. And in our case, this would be directly kind of comparable to our reservoirs or the Colorado River, where we have these very open channels that are driven much more by kind of what they call autochthonous systems, or they're generating their own energy through sunlight, algae, and production at the bottom, and very different processes than what happened up in the top in the headwaters. So again, river continuum concept, a lot of work has been done to improve this. It still holds up pretty well as a way of thinking about how watersheds work from the very top down to the bottom, and they are very different processes-wise and function-wise. A really important update to this, which came out in, I think it was 1997, 16 years later or so, was an update that kind of really, instead of it being this linear passage of components, whether it's organic matter or organisms that move through from the top to the bottom, what many ecologists started noticing that it wasn't just a direct passage. There was a whole lot of cyclical activity going on at the molecular and at the chemical level. And what they called that was the spiraling, nutrient spiraling or organic carbon, which are kind of the two big components of what moves through a river system, the energy that moves through a river system. And that those spirals, the timing of those spirals, the length of time it took for an individual molecule of carbon to move from the top to the bottom, had a whole lot to do with biotic and abiotic factors. And that spiraling is really important when you look at how nutrients are processed and changed. Their forms change from the headwaters as they move downstream. And this applies to, again, molecules all the way up to algae components that move down. And that spiraling can actually really drive a lot of what can and can't live in a river system. And it really changes the timing and the concentrations and the forms of these different materials that move down through that system. So this is a really important example of how this is really used nowadays. Is in the old days, we used to just look at concentrations of nutrients that were being discharged, for example, from a wastewater outfall for treated wastewater. And if you just model what that molecule of wastewater of organic carbon or nutrients that are coming from that wastewater directly as it floats downstream, it doesn't have a lot of dynamic character to it. But when you add this nutrient spiraling, you realize that the algae production and the components and the length of time that those nutrients actually stay in that system and feed these kind of ecological cycles is really an important part of how this system works. So that's really changed the way we model and think about nutrients as they move through systems. Okay, we're going to introduce this idea now of what we're calling the stream functional pyramid. This is some work that Harmon et al. Did for the EPA in 2012, and it's been also extremely influential. And it's really helped us in our department start to structure the way we think of watershed function. Stream functions and watershed functions, as you've heard, the valley rules the stream. So we're going to just kind of run through what this pyramid looks like with a little bit of detail. The concept is that the components at the base of the pyramid are the most important drivers. And as you move up the pyramid, their influence changes and influences the pieces and the layers above them. I do want to just say that hydrology is at the base layer, and it is the rainfall that falls on the watershed, but it's also how that water that falls out of the sky through precipitation moves through the entire watershed. It's how it gets into groundwater, how it flows over the land during storms, how it flows through the stream during base flow. And what we found is that hydrology, that movement of the water through the watershed, is extremely pivotal, extremely important, extremely dramatically the most important thing about how a watershed works. It is the base of the layer. As you move up to the next layer, what happens as water moves through a watershed, it concentrates and starts to form what we call hydraulic characters. This is the transport of the water in the channel. It can be in the floodplain, it can be rivulets above that, but it's generally when that water starts concentrating and actually forming up ways that we can measure it as a transportation component of that water. Above that, once it starts getting that and concentrating, it can start moving material, and that's the third layer. That's the geomorphology. That's the transportation of material in the watershed, overland, but a lot of times in the channel. That's the movement of wood, sediment, all the different kind of stuff that gets moved through the watershed by that water as it moves through this entire system. The geomorphology then in turn influences the chemical environment. And generally we're talking chemical as the physicochemical environment in the aquatic area in the stream, so in stream. And that is being driven by that hydrology, then the hydraulics and the geomorphology. That chemical environment includes your nutrient concentrations, the temperature of the stream, organic matter, etc. And then that above that is obviously the very top of the pyramid is biology. That's the response variable, the ultimate response variable. If you think about it, the base layer is the first thing that we're looking at, which is responding to precipitation. That's where your hydrology is. And then each one above there is responding to the next one or the next few below it. Biology at the top is responding to the entire pyramid. Biology is the place to go to measure to see what the health of a watershed is, because the biology that lives in it tells you a whole lot about how that watershed is functioning through all these pieces below it. We're going to kind of dig into this a little more. Within the stream functional pyramid, there's a whole lot of different measures and ways that we want to specifically focus on how hydrology, what it looks like in a particular watershed or in a stream. There's channel forming discharge is an important measure. I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but this just gives you a feeling for when we say hydrology, what are we talking about? We're talking about flood frequency, flow duration. We're talking about runoff coefficients and precipitation quantities in a particular part of the watershed. Again, hydrology is all that water moving through the watershed. Hydraulics, you're talking about floodplain connectivity, the flow dynamics in the channel, the individual ways that we look at flow moving through the channel. You're talking about groundwater, surface water exchange interactions as springs come out as water gets absorbed into recharge. Those are all hydraulic measurements. When you get into geomorphology, you'll notice there's a whole lot of different measures of geomorphology. It's because it's such a complex and dynamic part of this. Sediment transport, sediment competency and capacity, riparian vegetation, bed form diversity, and habitat. Those are all driven by geomorphology. Then you get into the aquatic environment and your physicochemical measures of nutrients and water quality. And then biology at the top, which is important that you note that that includes vegetation, microbial communities, plants, benthic macrovertebrates, and fish, and all those pieces. So this traditional approach to the functional pyramid that Harmon et al. Came up with 10 years ago or so. Super relevant. But what we've done is kind of transform that into thinking about how we would apply that in Austin. I'm going to quickly go through how hydrology works, again, because it's such an important part of that base of that pyramid. We're just going to run through how the stream functional pyramid, which can be applied to any system generally, might look in an urban environment. An undeveloped watershed, generally, as you add water to this system, you have a lot of vegetation and soil. Water falls on it. Some of that water goes off into surface runoff, and some of it goes into subsurface flow that's infiltrated. When you add impervious cover to that system, you make it urbanized, or you change the way that hydrology works in that. And when you add all that impervious cover, you get a very different response, basically by covering over all that soil and vegetation that you had in that undeveloped area. You've really changed the way that hydrology works in that watershed. I'm going to show you a table that kind of give you a little bit more of a quantitative way of looking at how that changes. This table is just looking at total impervious cover in this first column, and then a bunch of other really important measurements. But the gist of this story, the kind of critical piece of this information, is that as you add impervious cover, you get less and less rainfall that goes into the ground and more runoff. Just to give you a feeling for that, in the undeveloped watershed with zero impervious cover in Austin, Texas, for example, we get about 32 inches of rain. About 6% of all the rain that we get ends up becoming runoff, or about 1.18 inches of rain will actually run off in an undeveloped watershed over a year. When you add impervious cover, let's just say maximum, you add 100% impervious cover, now we're getting 78% of that runoff from all those rain events is running off. And that ends up being almost 23 inches of our 32 inches becomes direct runoff and doesn't go into the ground. That really fundamentally changes the way a watershed functions and the way hydrology is characterized in the way we look at a watershed. And what we've generally come to believe is that zero impervious cover represents a healthy system, and that 100% impervious cover represents a system that does not function in a healthy way, the way that ecology and biology would like it to work. Another component to urbanization, in addition to the impervious cover, is the routing, or the way that cities want to move water away from our structures and our infrastructure. This cartoon kind of gives you a good feeling for how that works. As you get a rain event, your runoff falls on the roof of this house and on this parking lot, runs down the driveway into the street. All the other precipitation that's falling on the street is also running down there. This is your traditional curb and gutter stormwater management system, where all that rain runoff goes very efficiently into this inlet gutter, ideally if it's not clogged, down into pipes routed underground directly to our streams. And what this means is we've created an extremely rapid way of moving water from our watersheds, from that entire area that a watershed represents, to these very specific point sources of large volumes of water that get moved directly to our streams. What that looks like in our streams is a lot of water carrying a lot of pollutants. All the pollutants that were in this yard and on this roof and in this driveway are very quickly moved into this system. So again, we're talking about a quantity and a quality issue. What that results in, that huge pulse of water that gets jettisoned straight into our creeks, is erosion. It results in water pollution. All the nutrients that are collected in that storm instead of them running over land or into soil and underground during groundwater and getting filtered, they're directly shot straight to our stream, and that nutrient spiraling cycle that we talked about initiates, where we have nutrients that don't just flow straight downstream but get locked into the stream, cycle through with algae communities, and cause a lot of problems in our streams. A lot of the pollutants go into the sediments and sit there, and this is what our urban creeks look like. And they also, as we know, can result in flooding. Now, our flood kind of system, our climate in Austin, is going to cause floods whether we have impervious cover or not. What impervious cover does is it just accentuates or exaggerates those pulses. The flooding that we see that is influenced strongly by impervious cover are probably our smaller to mid-size events, not the massive catastrophic events that we see sometimes. But the amount of impervious cover definitely increases the volume of water that we see in our streams and causes a lot of flooding concerns in the nuisance range generally. So now taking that kind of background of urbanization and putting that onto this concept of a functional pyramid, I'm just going to kind of walk you through how we're now thinking of our watershed that we showed you earlier in this urban watershed functional pyramid. First of all, I want to point out that yes, hydrology is the base layer, and it's what we're going to focus on as a driver for how watersheds work in an urban environment. But we also always have to remember that, as I pointed out in the beginning, the geology of our system, the ancient, important underlying structures of what's here also is extremely important to how water moves through a watershed. And of course, our climate, the way our rainfall patterns happen, their dry periods happen, those are extremely important to how hydrology ends up being expressed in a given watershed. Keep that in mind. So you've got your base layer, your hydrology driver, water in, water out. Keep in mind that now we're talking about that hydrology as influenced by urbanization. As we move up, we've decided to collapse hydraulics and geomorphology into one layer. They're intertwined. They have lots of crossover. All these are intertwined and interrelate with each other. But we found that one kind of simplified could really work pretty well just by keeping those two together, because as you get your concentrated hydraulic flow, that is when you start moving material and causing erosion, causing sediment to move, and those kind of pieces go well together. So we've got that brown layer as our geomorph hydraulics. We move up to that physical chemical environment, as we talked about, very kind of critical for what a biological form might experience in the stream. That's your nutrients, that's your temperature, E. coli, some of the contaminants that come in urban systems, the sediments that are contaminated from our urban lifestyle. And then at the top of this pyramid, as we've already discussed, you got your biology. But one of the things I want to clarify about this particular part of our pyramid, this top section, is it doesn't only include your natural kind of background aquatic organisms, it includes humans. The human component to this pyramid is absolutely critical, because humans are in urban systems, they are the ultimate response variable. We're the ones who are experiencing how a watershed feels, how it influences our health of our bodies, our healths of our minds. And importantly, we are ecosystem engineers. We do a lot in these systems to influence the physicochemical environment, to influence the physical geomorphological environment, to influence the hydrology, the way water moves through these watersheds, as I just showed you with impervious cover and the different stormwater effects. And we also have the ability to improve some of the pathways and the ways that all these layers of this pyramid all come together to form this healthy watershed. We can't do a lot about geology and climate, but we actually do quite a bit on these layers in the functional pyramid. And I do want to note, just because it's in our department, the Watershed Protection Department traditionally has been defined by the missions that we focus on. The flooding mission, which is at that hydrology level, the erosion mission, which is in the geomorphology, and the water quality mission, which kind of maybe could be in that yellow physical chemical area. But really, these are all directly influencing each other. We've learned through looking at a lot of the biology in our streams that it's being influenced by all these layers in very dramatic ways, particularly the hydrology, particularly the habitat and the geomorphology. And the idea that water quality is defined by chemistry is not appropriate. The idea that these missions should be at all insulated from each other is not really true. So I'd like to suggest that we stop talking about these missions as independent or as separate or as isolated. So let's get rid of those. And let's just kind of think about this functional pyramid as a way to focus our work and think about where we're going and how we might better create healthy watersheds and focus on watersheds as our functional tool and our functional unit to work on and improve.